Welcome everybody. This is our second breakout today with Dave McCarricher. And David's going to discuss, excuse me, but you've got something in your teeth. And Dave is also the originator of the ContraPoint Stank Mean Stash. He is the genius behind it, and we're really grateful to have him here today. And he is the main organizer of everything we're doing here today. So thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you. So I prefer the pronouns they, them. I think we should dox Bert. I'm just kidding. Because that was some horse. I'm just kidding. So this is my submission for 0 books. We'll see how that goes. I've had a couple of people read it over and give me criticisms that are great, and I haven't implemented them yet. And so what's about to go up is a less polished version of this than I have in my heart right now. And I would just kind of like sit. I'm gonna read it though. It doesn't matter. So, all right. It's called "Excuse Me, but You've Got Something in Your Teeth: How the Anti-SJW Industry Exploits Ressentiment." Have you ever had a piece of food stuck in your teeth? Did someone point it out? Did you wish they had said something sooner? Why didn't someone tell me before I went to that job interview, before talking to my crush, before taking the sacrament? Sometimes people don't say anything because they don't want to make you feel embarrassed, but how much worse will it be after going through an entire day assuming everything is fine to only afterwards realize nobody was willing to point it out? If friends say nothing, the person who draws attention to the food matter lodged in your teeth may be at best a child making an innocent observation, or at worst, an enemy or bully. Ignorance of basic concepts can also function a lot like that thing that was stuck in your teeth. In fact, you cannot become a part of any human group without learning basic concepts shared within that community. Human individuals form a sense of identity given affiliation to or separation from groups. Any group of humans has its set of interests, assumptions, and working concepts. To show ignorance of a basic concept exposes you as an outsider. Sometimes this is just a little awkward, but other times it leads to fatal error, especially when fundamental to the entire conversation. For instance, if you don't understand capitalism the way critics of capitalism use it, or privilege the way it is used in gender or race theory, then you not only expose yourself as an outsider, but you probably sound foolish, or like C. Derek Varn. No, I'm just kidding. I just added that. So you probably sound foolish and will say things that sound crude, if not malicious. I'm kidding. You probably understand it better than I do. But I argue that the same can be said for understanding the concept of ressentiment. One of the most compelling and concerning aspects of Jordan B. Peterson's message is a point he borrows from Nietzsche, that ours is a culture of ressentiment. Not just our society, but especially the left. This has become common fare for the anti-SJW industry to bemoan campus activism, grievance studies, and identity politics of being steeped in ressentiment. Usually, this goes unexplained. And for those who have not studied this concept, it is often conceived of as simply as resentment, which is not entirely the same thing. Ressentiment goes a lot deeper, in fact, so deep that it's arguably inescapable. However, to the degree that Peterson is correct, the left should check itself, because playing into ressentiment unselfconsciously is a lot like going through life with spinach stuck in one's teeth. Too bad a bully had to point it out. Now it's time to understand what it is, and then I will finish by showing why Peterson is even a worse offender than the left he castigates. What is ressentiment? First things first. Wikipedia is currently mistaken about ressentiment. In the preamble to the wiki article, ressentiment is construed as meaning little more than hostility towards an oppressor or towards the strong by the weak. This is certainly how it is used in anti-SJW industry parlance, but this fundamentally misses an important point made by Nietzsche. Ressentiment is not just the ideas and ideology espoused by the weak when they critique the strong. Rather, at a deeper level still, ressentiment is a way of gaining a sense of superiority on the cheap. What do I mean by that? How does ressentiment help us gain a sense of superiority on the cheap? Well, let's use an example. Imagine we live in a society that revolves around Tetris, the classic video game invented by the Soviets. Whoever has the highest Tetris score in the room is given the most respect and privileges. You have two options: play within this framework of values or renounce this framework entirely. If you play within this framework of values, then you will either have to pay homage to the people who are better at Tetris than you are, or work tirelessly to become the best. If you renounce this framework, however, then you can, at least in your own mind, get off the hook entirely. You could even start a little club of friends who think Tetris is a stupid rubric by which to judge the worth of humans. Ressentiment goes a step further, though, by saying Tetrisism, in this case, is itself bad. Something can be conceived as bad in either a moral or intellectual sense, or both. If it's morally bad, we consider it evil, whereas we call intellectual corruption stupidity or ignorance. If Tetrisism, the ideology of a society built around Tetris' achievement, can be portrayed as morally and intellectually bankrupt, then those of us who refuse to play are able to gain a cheap sense of moral and intellectual superiority and self-certainty by doing nothing. Nietzsche claims that Judaism, Christianity, and socialism are decisive moments in Western history when entire cultures turned against the powerful class of masters and achievers. As with Tetrisism, if all honor and prestige in a society is granted to the conquering elite, then the less powerful are able to gain intellectual and moral superiority through ressentiment by turning against the entire values framework itself. According to Nietzsche, before these decisive cultural shifts, being better came from literally being better or more powerful, from making a mark on the world by courageously winning. However, with the rise of civilization, we all become like caged beasts that are most of the time unable to act on our animal instincts. Our will to power, unable to find immediate exercise, thus turns inward, and so begins the history of humanity and morals. Literally, this sense of ressentiment, of not being able to just act on instinctual impulse, is the thing that carves out the space from which you have a soul, a psyche, a humane human existence. All instincts, okay, this is a quote by Nietzsche. I think it's a lengthy one. So, all instincts that do not discharge themselves outwardly, this is what I call the internalization of man. Thus it was that man first developed what was later called his soul. The entire inner world, originally as thin as if it were stretched between two membranes, expanded and extended itself, acquired depth, breadth, and height in the same measure as outward discharge was inhibited. This is from it's basic writings, but I have it in The Genealogy of Morals. Notice that this quote reveals something later emphasized by Guy Deleuze, that Nietzsche is not saying that ressentiment is a psychological function, but rather the inaugurating cause of psychological life itself. There is a sense in which, then, ressentiment would be inescapable. So why point it out? Because this is such a fundamental basis of our interior life, it is easily exploited. And it's also easy to fall prey to taking insights revealed by ressentiment as some objective fact of reality rather than one of the deepest seated forms of bias. So, the next header is called Nietzsche's Entire Point. While the right wing champions Nietzsche's work as a critique of basic concerns for justice, it's important to remember that criticism of something does not amount to wholesale disregard. After all, Nietzsche says in the same essay from Genealogy of Morals that human history would be altogether too stupid a thing without the spirit that the impotent have introduced into it, right? So without the impotent and what they've introduced into the history of humanity, we'd be a bunch of fucking idiots, right? This means that intellectuals, himself included, are most of all implicated with the spirit of ressentiment. How so? Here he plays into the idea, it's kind of like a stereotype, right? That the intellectual is someone who is unable to excel elsewhere in life. Being unable to dominate in sports, business, or politics, the thinker turns inward to cultivate an intellectual upper hand. Surely Nietzsche is not saying that all intellectual endeavors are false or useless. So what is he saying? It should be noted that anyone who tells you Nietzsche's entire point is already wrong. Nietzsche is a complicated and notoriously conflicted thinker. Like his Christian existentialist counterpart Soren Kierkegaard, Nietzsche's thought is always working through contradictions. For instance, Nietzsche himself was a weak man, plagued by painful and debilitating illness, yet he comes to the defense of the strong. You could also argue that Nietzsche was an intellectual critic of intellectuals, an ascetic critic of ascetics, and a moralizing critic of moralists. This makes a lot of sense if we keep in mind ressentiment and how it functions. In no way was Nietzsche trying to rid the world of ressentiment and thus make the history of humanity more brutish and stupid, contrary to what the Nazis believed. I just inserted that. That's not in there, but maybe it should be. But rather, he sought to show the historical conditions for our sense of morality and with it the basis for the guilty conscience. Anyone who grows up in a morally suffocating, guilt-festering religious environment will understand why Nietzsche, son of a pastor, concerned himself with the historical origins of guilt, the ways guilt is used against us, and how our need to feel morally justified leads to sick and manipulative ideology. The point is not to renounce all values, but to show how value is historically constructed and culturally relative so that we can become freer spirits and invent a new system of values. I believe this is the last section, but I'm not sure. How we can use ressentiment. This is a very lengthy quote. It was shared just like last week or 2 weeks ago by Jaden Adams from the New Center for Research and Practice. And I just thought this is such a great quote, and it's so relevant. I'll use the whole damn thing, because most of us aren't used to hearing Martin Luther King talk about Nietzsche. Most of us are just used to hearing Martin Luther King say, "I had a dream," because they always use that one little segment. But this is a speech that he gave at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Presidential Address, August 16th, 1967. He says, "There is nothing wrong with power if power is used correctly. You see, what happened is that one of our philosophers got off base. And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with a resignation of power and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused Nietzsche, who was a philosopher of the will to power, to reject the Christian concept of love. It was the same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject the Nietzschean philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. Now, we've got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." We'll just call it a day. That's it. Go home. Call a conference off. We figured it out. Okay. The history of humanity has been brutish and stupid because we didn't all learn that quote in high school. We should not use ressentiment to discredit the existence of morals per se, but rather as a check for self-criticism. Are we truly concerned with morality or about feeling morally superior? Do we really care about intellectual charlatanism, or are we simply looking for cheap intellectual superiority? Do we really do good deeds out of a sense of moral obligation to the other, or as a cheap sense of entitlement over others? This is why ignorance of the concept of ressentiment can make you look more foolish than a person with spinach in their teeth. Because if a Christian or a socialist simpers on and on about how bad that person is or how corrupt that institution is, a lot of the time the cheap sense of superiority they are gaining in this demonstration is painstakingly obvious to everyone else. Whether or not they know what the concept is, you all feel it, and it's gross. We should then remain self-critical and always ask what kinds of cheap thrills we get by discrediting others. At the same time, let's not let ourselves off the hook. While Peterson likes to cherry-pick, stereotype, and strawman the left as ressentiment-riddled campus radicals who would change the entire social order when they can't even clean their own bedrooms, he seems to have missed the hilarious fact that the anti-SJW industry currently making him rich is itself entirely founded on ressentiment. Unlike the ressentiment of certain campus radicals, however, his goes a step further. You see, whereas the campus radical has to actually take a stand and go out in public to advocate for a less exploitive social system, Peterson is making a career out of telling people to basically do exactly what their parents and society has already told them to do, i.e. clean your room, mind your own business, get a job, and raise a family. Literally, just fucking go with the flow. You don't really have to change anything significant. Don't even worry about educating yourself on the bigger issues, and especially don't concern yourself with changing them. You are better because you're not doing anything. You're literally just getting your cheap sense, your cheap thrills of intellectual and moral superiority by doing jack shit. An essential mechanism of the anti-SJW industry. If we keep in mind that at the heart of ressentiment is a desire for cheap intellectual or moral superiority, then it would make a lot of sense for the media to develop mechanisms for feeding this desire. After all, capitalism is about connecting us with the products we desire, right? It should come as no surprise then that the media has done exactly this. Whether it's mainstream or alternative media, we should always be suspicious of any news or commentary outlet whose bread and butter consists of cherry-picking instances of stupidity or evil on the part of the perceived other, whether these are Democrats, Republicans, anarchists, or socialists. The anti-SJW industry has been selling this image of hysterical feminists, terrifying Antifa protesters, and stupid-sounding students for years. But only with the rise of Jordan Peterson did the notion suddenly come to popular fruition that the uniting force between all these stereotypes is a fearful postmodern feminist neo-Marxist plot to undermine Western values. Sure, this idea has been around for some time, dating back to the early days of German National Socialist conspiracy theories about Jewish Bolsheviks, but Peterson has brought it to the mainstream. More than just cherry-picking positive instances that confirm our biases, though, people are even susceptible to using negative instances, the evidence that should contradict our biases as confirmation of their prejudice. Slavoj Žižek uses an anti-Semite as an example of how deep this us, they, them ideology can go. When an anti-Semite meets his Jewish neighbor, who is on all counts not just a normal person, but actually a dutiful citizen and a caring neighbor, the anti-Semite thinks, quote, "You see how dangerous they really are? It is difficult to recognize their real nature. They hide behind the mask of everyday appearance, and it is exactly this hiding of one's real nature, this duplicity, that is a basic feature of the Jewish nature," right? So even though you have this evidence to the contrary of your theory, you're able to use that as proof. In this framework, the Jew is always either a bumbling idiot or a sneaky genius up to no good. Now, anything the other does can be rendered as data for confirming the anti-Semite's prejudiced worldview. This is from the Sublime Object of Ideology. This either stupid or sneaky genius up to no good dichotomy provides a razor's edge with which to cleave all data from the other into boxes that help us make sense of the world, but even more so, that feeds our desire for cheap superiority. If I see the other look stupid, then I by default feel smart because I'm not a part of that stupid tribe. If I see the other look like a sneaky genius who is up to no good, then I gain a sense of de facto moral superiority. Peterson, Shapiro, Rubin, Pinker, and so many more of the anti-SJW industry would have you think that anyone trying to criticize the shortcomings of society or pushing for improvements must be causing more harm than good. You are, therefore, naturally smarter because you aren't wasting your time. And in fact, you're even more moral because at least you're not out there causing more chaos. Don't these radicals realize we've never had it so good? They should be praising capitalism and thanking the 1%. Ultimately, we all need a sense that we are not blundering fools and that we are doing more good than harm in the world. This desire, though, is exploited by those who would have us do nothing to resolve historical injustices or undermine institutions of oppression, exploitation, and alienation. Focus on yourself and what's close by is good advice if your immediate life is a wreck. But it's also a cheap evasion of responsibility for contending with the bigger issues in life that some of us, especially Peterson and his fan base, disproportionately benefit from. This is one of those ways that just not understanding the basics of privilege is like the spinach in the teeth thing too, right? Because if you're going to talk about these things and you're just not very concerned about something that you're disproportionately benefiting from, then you look kind of like an asshat. Rather than resist the desire to feel good about ourselves through moral or intellectual pursuits, we must instead maintain vigilance against getting these... Okay, I'm going to start this paragraph over, and it's like the last paragraph, which is why I didn't want to Okay. Rather than resist the desire to feel good about ourselves through moral or intellectual pursuits, we must instead maintain a vigilance against getting these boosts through interpassivity, which is the sense of gaining either by doing nothing. Peterson puts himself on the altar of culture as a sacrifice for free speech, free thought, and freedom from responsibility of changing the conditions that disproportionately distribute precarity to marginalized people. Peterson says you don't have to change anything outside of your bedroom to feel more moral than those who fight for justice. You don't have to read Judith Butler to try to understand where gender feminists are coming from. Just shake your head at videos of hysterical people who are reduced to this intellectual trend and congratulate yourself for how sensible you are in comparison. No need to read, in fact. He will do it for you. Just go get a job in the STEM fields, bucko. Sure thing, doctor. But first, I just need to point out that you have something lodged in your teeth. Thank you.
He doesn't actually read though.
The Gulag Archipelago, one book by Dostoevsky. What, there's like 3 other books in there. Robert.
So you mentioned a lot these figures that Peterson holds up. I just came from Andrew Wood's talk about how he holds up the Enlightenment using Hicks's book. Would you say that Peterson tends to operate in the realm of symbolic, in that he uses Nietzsche in how we understand him symbolically? He uses the Jew as we understand them symbolically. He uses the Enlightenment as we understand it symbolically, rather than focusing on any sort of thing, which allows him to build this ressentiment, because then when he gets to postmodernism, he can reduce it to the symbolic as well, and essentially say, look at that dumb feminist, that's all that exists.
So it sounds like that makes a lot of sense. The only problem I have with that is if I'm trying to track that through Lacanian registers, I'm not exactly sure I'm able to do that because I haven't spent the time doing that, but it sounds good. And we'll go to you in a half sec, Mackenzie, unless it's a direct follow-up. It is. Okay, yeah.
It's like, and it goes into the other question I was going to ask you. Because I think it's really crucial to think about the difference between symbolic and imaginary. I would say much, much, much more between imaginary and symbolic. And I think especially when we talk about how the phallus, so the context about the phallic signifier as an imaginary signifier, as like sort of anchoring certainly like a particular historical dimension of discourse in a particular kind of imaginary meaning. And this idea of like the kind of like organic social totality that Jordan Peterson kind of like ethically, morally privileges, and like the dismissal, the like perverse dismissal of things that undermine it, I feel like is sort of his MO. I actually specifically want to say personally, I find the Freudian concept of the superego and Lacan's theory of perversion much more helpful here necessarily than Nietzsche's ressentiment, although that kind of gets at another angle.
Totally.
But I think what you're talking about ressentiment is basically what Lacan called perversion. So he's reading with Freud because it's the idea of like, it's kind of this sort of sarcastic thing of like, well, like here's like this symptom, and like we all know that there's this sort of failing, but like LOL, like it doesn't really matter. Like
Totally.
we're trying to like disrupt or challenge our like perverse symptom, like very disavowing and saying like, oh, like like it's like everyone knows it's stupid, but like why fucking change it? Like you can't change it. Like yes, like capitalism sucks, inequality sucks. Like sometimes people get like psychotic and are like, no, it's perfect, it's great, right? And then it's like, whoa. But like when it's like the sort of more common thing is to say like, well, like it sucks.
It's the best of all. It's the least.
So, like,
it's the least
like,
bad.
Yeah. Don't take away the symptom, or else you're going to get a worse one. Why? That's perversion, right? And that's also it does become a moralistic thing, because it's sort of this ironic thing. Lacan talks about perversion, where it's kind of like an undermining of the father that is only still like on the authority of the father figure. Like Peterson is being turned into a particular kind of like name of the father for these people. That is like they are kind of like weaponizing that in this way that is also supposedly subversive, because it's like it's against what they see as actually a reigning undermining of the name of the father. That they're trying to like reinstate this paternal authority that like supposedly is threatened. And I think there are lots of layers to this that we can talk about for ages, but I'm gonna leave it there for now.
And just a quick plug, since we brought it up, I'm just gonna show my other gang meme group, because I don't believe that the conference should be immature at all, right? And we shouldn't just be making fun the whole time. But there is this part of me that needs to be able to do that while I'm trying to be serious over here. So the other foot in the world is like in the sounds like you just want Peterson to be your daddy, but okay. Which is actually,
No, it's true.
it started
It's true.
out
It's really true.
because it's deep in the sense that you're pointing at, but it's also just like, when you're in the comments sections and they really start to sound that way, and you don't want to have to discourse any longer, it's a good way to peace out. You just kind of tag group and then you leave. And then if they click on that, there's actually a bunch of great memes and resources for them. Anyway, Jacob.
I really think that ressentiment is really interesting in terms of Peterson because he talks about it all the time.
Right?
It seems to be he seems to fundamentally misunderstand the difference between master and slave morality because he posits them as a sort of dialectic, right? The master overcomes the slave, which is fundamentally misunderstanding Nietzsche, right? Because for Nietzsche, if it's the master who's overcoming the slave, then that's fundamentally still, the master is still within slave morality. So something I've been thinking about throughout this whole conference so far is that a lot of how we operate the conversation works within the register of ressentiment and slave morality. It posits a group against another group. I think this is a fundamental failing of the Democrats historically in the US, for instance, in their prioritization of something like affirmative action, which is not a bad policy in and of itself, but it's a policy which posits one group, one's singular identity, as benefiting in some way. And in that way, it does operate on the field of ressentiment insofar as it's operating on a singular identity. And so I wonder if the solution to this is to affirm a unilateral or universal politics rather than a particular politics. Because I think anytime we operate on a particular politics, we're operating on an inversion of what Peterson is doing, right? Because what Peterson is doing is he's inverting what he sees as the social justice warrior, but he's going against that, and in that way he's reactionary.
He's the individual justice warrior, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's all it's a reaction against the justice warrior. But I also think that any politics that has its sole basis on this sort of identity also falls into this sort of reactionary mode. This isn't to say that identity politics is bad and that focusing on bad things that happen to certain groups is bad. That's totally a good thing to do. But positing our solutions as unilateral, I think, might be a more effective way at breaking from this sort of ressentiment politics that is so pervasive.
Yeah.
And I wonder how that fits into what you're thinking here.
Well, it fits in insofar as that really long sentence on the last paragraph when I said the thing about this disavowal of the responsibility for those historical injustices that disproportionately favor whatever group he's appealing to mainly, while neglecting and harming the groups that get a disproportionate share of precarity in society. And that's like a long fucking way of putting it, but I'm liking that way of putting it because that's how Butler talks about it in Notes to a Performative Theory of Assemblage, which I think is a really great short little book. She uses, Arendt and Levinas to sort of save one another from like their worst pitfalls, which is like the awesome thing that Zizek does with Hegel and Lacan, right? And I think that when she does this, it's okay. Precarity. If you just think about precarity, if we get away from the language of marginalization, it's not good enough because everyone knows someone's always marginalized in any given situation, and everyone's experienced how they're marginalized in this group or that group, and blah blah blah. No, let's just talk about precarity and the fact that we all experience precarity, but that some people, just because of X, Y, or Z factors, are literally statistically susceptible to undue amounts of that, and I think that this is a universal politics. It's the basis for a revolutionary subject, and that that the precariat, right, is really cool to say instead of the proletariat, right, because it includes like the unemployed, it includes the heart surgeons who are about to lose their fucking jobs because they're gonna, automation is gonna put them out because 12 years of schooling is very expensive, right? So it's really interesting when you have a new revolutionary subject that's called the precariat that kind of bridges those old divides where it's just like, yeah, heart surgeons are on board with truckers now because of automation. And that's the element that I'm putting that in from Peter Frey's and Four Futures. I'm not getting that from Butler, but it's kind of implicit there. So, do we have time for another, or do we have to run?
It's like 4:11.
Yeah, it's time. But Emily, go ahead.
Hold on, wait.
Just say it. Just say it.
I'm just interested in the, you said precarity, and I think during the last podcast we just watched, it seems like there's a lot of getting hung up on language about privilege, and if you sort of invert that language and talk about it in terms of precarity, then it ends up in a landscape
Totally.
where you don't have to feel called out because somebody put you on top of some hierarchy that you
Totally.
feel like you're on.
Right, exactly. And by the way, I'll just also say that the whole privilege calculus game and the groups and the way you were just talking about what's the word with an A?
Affirmative action.
Yeah, affirmative action, right? So it just in those terms, like that's the one thing that ever came out of critical theory that the neoliberal like institutions are able to like really easily like adopt, and then they can use it to toot their own fucking horns, right? Which is just like insane, and it doesn't say anything about precarity because it doesn't say anything about externalities. So,
Well, the other thing I think that, and this is not like some deep philosophical insight, but I think affirmative action also kind of stands as this thing that Democrats are very quick to distance themselves from. Like every high school liberal I know will put Cherokee down the moment they find out that they're a 64. I mean, literally Congresswoman just, basically proved that she used it solely for affirmative action benefits. So I'd say it exists as much to benefit white people who need that little rich white people, I should say, who need that little extra edge, as it does to benefit actual marginalized groups. And that's why it's so hard to explain to lower income, more white working class people who, hear this and are like, why can't I go to college on the same thing? And it's very easy for Republicans to then say, well, I want to get rid of that.
Not defending Elizabeth Warren, but that's not exactly what she did. She was already hired at Harvard before she put herself in that box, in that category. And it's like, it's the reason why it's not, it didn't have anything to do.
I've seen some really cool posts on this topic, and I've seen some really cool posts on this topic. I don't know anything about it, but I will just say, as a way of closing this out, that my favorite thing about conferences is that they concentrate a bunch of people who like to talk and then tell them not to talk, and then it pumps them full of ideas, and then it lets them out for like a second, so they and then back to being concentrated, and then we're about to finish off with Rollins, and then we all get to go to a restaurant place, and it's going to be dope, and I'm buying everybody a round of drinks. It's not me, NSP is. So thanks. All right.
Moving